Welcome back, our esteemed viewers. We'll continue with our questioning to David today. So, David, in our risk management processes, what is risk assessment?
Oh, thank you very much, Brenda. Remember, we are talking about generic processes, and we have looked at establishing the context. We have been able to understand how we going at where. How are we going to address these risks? Okay. Remember, we had said risks are effect of uncertainties on objectives. So, and we have already seen the objectives.
Yes.
But we cannot be able to manage a risk we don't know.
Okay.
So the next stage will be to identify what are these risks that can affect the objective. That is called risk identification. It is asking ourselves what might happen. I mean, if you ask yourself what might happen, then it will prompt us to go and identify what are the risks that can affect our objectives. And various ways can be used to identify risk. People might get into a workshop and then they ask, what risks do we expect? They can go to a department and put a questionnaire. You know, they can sit in a place where and brainstorm. There are various ways to which identification of risk can be done. Risk identification is very important and key as part of the risk assessment. The first stage in the risk assessment, you have to identify. You have to know which are the risks are we going to control. That is risk identification. After we identify these risks, then we have to ask ourselves, how likely are they going to happen? And if they do happen, what is the impact? Okay. If, for example, the likelihood to happen is high, and the impact will be very high, then we might decide what action are we going to take. If, for example, Brenda, we say that a rope is tied between one building and another one. And the objective is that you want to get money, which is promised on the other side. Okay. And it is a 2 billion amount of cash. You can use the rest of your life. But the condition is that you have to pass on top of that rope, balancing, you get to the other side. You not being, or myself not being an expert in walking along high-headed ropes, the likelihood of falling is almost certain. And the impact will be very high. So you see, we have assessed the likelihood to be high, and the impact will be high. So risk assessment, we are just asking ourselves what could happen. Or for example, let's assume we have our grandmothers and our grandfathers, and there's a risk that my grandfather will divorce my grandmother at 90 years. And the question is, how likely is it? Maybe the likelihood is very low, but what will be the impact if my grandmother is thrown out into the streets? She cannot remarry. You know, those are the ways in which we can be able to now do the risk assessment, trying to understand how is the likelihood, how is the impact, and that now we call it risk analysis. We are analyzing the risk as part of the risk assessment. And the third one now, because risks, we would have an objective, but the risks are many. Yeah, one objective could have a host, so many risks that could affect it. The question we ask, will the resources we have be able to address all the risks that can affect our objectives? And the practical answer is, it's not possible. Yes. So we need to do some risk evaluation and say, which are the big ones we can prioritize and address. That is now evaluating, so that we are able to be within our budget and we are able to address the risks that could really affect our objectives. So when we are doing that, we are doing an evaluation. Actually, it's like a decision point. Okay. Are we going to manage this risk, or are we going to transfer it to another person? Are we going to avoid it? Are we going to terminate it? Or are we just going to ignore it because it's the impact is raw, the likelihood is raw? So all those now will be evaluating whether we need to proceed as a decision to manage these risks. So risk assessment is about risk identification, risk analysis on the likelihood and impact, and then the decision point of risk evaluation, and how are we going to deal with ones? Which ones are we going to deal with? Now that is risk assessment.
Thank you so much. So our viewers, today we have learned about risk assessment, which includes risk identification, risk analysis, as well as risk evaluation that leads to risk controls. For more of this content, subscribe, like, share, comment. Thank you. See you again.